Okay, everybody, welcome. I want to welcome people to this event of migration, social responsibility, and moral imagination. Small technical topics of minor importance, obviously. My name is Dan Kanstrom, and it's my pleasure to see a room more or less full of people, actual humans. I haven't seen many of you for a while. Certainly haven't seen many of you unmasked. We ask that people do wear masks for the obvious reasons. We may take ours off occasionally to speak, but don't take that as be a leader, not a follower, is what I would say. So let me introduce her. She will speak to you for about 20 to 25 minutes about this joint book project that it was such a pleasure to be a part of. And then if there's a little time after that, I may speak about my modest contribution to this enterprise, and then we'll open it up for Q&A, which, as I say, we hope will be robust. We do tend to give priority to students to ask questions at these events through the Center for Human Rights, but it's not that's not to dissuade anybody else. That's just to encourage students to be bold and speak up. Okay, so Kristen Heyer is a professor of theological ethics and director of graduate studies in the theology department at Boston College. Her books include Kinship Across Borders, A Christian Ethic of Immigration, and Prophetic and Public, The Social Witness of U.S. Catholicism, which won the College Theology Society's Best Book Award, both of which were published in Georgetown University Press. She has also published a number of co-edited volumes, which I will not list for you, although they're available on her website. And her articles have appeared in Theoretical Studies, the Journal of the Society of Christian Ethics, the Journal of Catholic Social Thought, and many, many other important venues. Professor Heyer serves as co-chair of the Planning Committee for Catholic Theological Ethics in the World Church, a global network that fosters connections within the World Church, and vice president of Catholic Theological Society of America. Again, I'm going to skip a couple of things because she has a very long and very prestigious resume, and she's a modest person, and she has important things to tell you about that I want to leave as much time for as possible. She received a BA from Brown University and a PhD in theological ethics from Boston College in 2003. She lives in Newton with her family. If I may say so, she is a wonderful colleague, and I really do feel privileged to have engaged with you on this project and to be engaged with you and continue dialogue, which I hope will continue for at least the next 40 or 50 years on my end, and longer on yours.
Great, thank you so much, Dan. I'm going to unmask just for the presentation portion if folks are comfortable for the Zoom audience. Yes. Great. Okay, so I thought I would say just a few words about the book in general, and then the invitation was to talk about my solo chapter in the book, and then as Dan mentioned, he can talk about his own contribution, which included a joint chapter with me. Facebook tells me it was 3 years ago this week that we gathered a group of legal scholars and biblical scholars and theologians together in Atlanta. And the idea was, on a topic like migration, bringing these disciplines together could be really generative and fruitful. I will say, it was a pleasure to work with Dan, but I will say that interdisciplinarity in person can be harder than affirming it in theory. So we workshopped our solo chapters and were able to talk across disciplines about the topics you see behind me in red and in blue. So the first third of the book is topical chapters by legal scholars, the second third by theologians, and then what I've enlarged in purple are the jointly authored chapters across these two disciplines. So you can see topics like religious liberty, sanctuary, displacement, and globalization. And we'll have a minute to talk a bit about our own at the end. I do think in the end, this was really fruitful. I think that the co-authored chapters bring texture to more flat accounts that can sometimes mislead. I think that they contextualize migrations, reveal kind of ideological drivers of policy. They reveal the role of power and unveil new understandings of citizenship from below. So our hope is that the volume by putting Christian theology and practice into dialogue with law and policy, can challenge operative agendas. Great, it worked this time. Okay, just to say that COVID delayed the volume a bit. So the point of departure in most of our chapters is the last administration, Donald Trump's administration. But I do think 1 year into the Biden administration, really much of the argument holds. I don't know that we're as far as I guess I personally might have hoped. So I think arguments about the function of populism and xenophobia still continue to have relevance. After our manuscript went to press, Pope Francis issued a new encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, that similarly highlights the role of harmful narratives that impact migrants and the promise of the Christian story by contrast. We're leaving it to readers and all of you to decide if that means we have a papal endorsement of our book or not. But his approach, honestly, like ours, indicates how patterns that instill fear and threaten human rights reflect tendencies to approach migration primarily as a matter of crisis management. And I think this, we've shown, neglects transnational political and economic forces, as well as histories of relationship between sending and receiving countries. Just over a month ago on the island of Lesbos, Pope Francis lamented how the Mediterranean is becoming a cemetery due to illusory narratives of personal and national self-interest. In Fratelli Tutti, he draws attention to the forces impacting so many people on the move, expanding the migration question to consider the impact of populist discourse, neoliberal economics, and virulent individualism. This scope shifts the narrative, we might say, offering a welcome reorientation to discussions that often just focus on states' rights or on border crossers alone. He revisits longstanding commitments to the humanity of migrants and the gifts that they bring. But his broader emphases reveal how barriers to reception and humane policy are not limited to matters of border fortification or refugee policies alone, but they include pervasive tendencies toward isolation. He traces how the Christian story that insists we fundamentally belong to each other, that we survive and thrive only through encounter with others, can serve as really an antidote to this indifference and individualism that harm persons on the move. My own chapter in our volume similarly shows how, in contrast to reigning models in migration ethics, so realism, cosmopolitanism, communitarianism, that really tend to address individual rights of movement, relational commitments underscore social dimensions of justice and of sinful complicity alike. The Christian story's universal destination of created goods similarly accents constraints on market freedom, our understandings of what belongs to one another. The encyclical's foundational social emphases ground his analyses of structures pulling and pushing migrants across borders like pawns on a chessboard, as he has said. So maybe in parts, he's referring to exploitative economic models, in other parts, aggressive models of international relations. So these broader emphases reveal how barriers to reception include pervasive tendencies toward isolationism and populist ideologies. Recent years have witnessed a rise in nativist populism, fueled in part by anxieties about the economic impact of globalization. In the US context, we've seen these trends play out via the politics of exclusion peddled throughout the Trump's campaigning and governing scripts alike. Even as we may hope for further progress under the Biden administration, our immigration context conversations in this country have long been shaped by narratives emphasizing security threats, social costs, despite our rhetoric about liberty and hospitality. The last administration's more than 400 executive actions on immigration, from border and interior enforcement to the asylum system to DACA, to ostensibly make America safe again, followed from its law and order mantle, even as studies regularly indicate higher rates of immigration correlate with lower rates of violent and property crime. Migrants from the Central American countries in the Northern Triangle region are often fleeing context of the world's highest homicides per capita. So they're fleeing a situation where gang members kill with impunity, precisely the breakdown of rule of law at home. Another populist script casts immigrants as economic threats. This is a perception we've seen historically heightened in times of economic downturn. Beyond studies that show that immigrant laborers provide a net benefit to the US economy, the detention industry profits from irregular migrants, further confounding this frame of economic threat. So today, the multi-billion-dollar transnational immigrant industrial complex raises serious questions about the financial stakes of a broken immigration system, not to mention diminished accountability or public oversight. I saw in the news this week, Biden is planning some steps to shift detention and move toward the elimination of the private system, as his campaign promised. Finally, tapping into anti-immigrant sentiment provokes the demonization of racial, ethnic, and religious minorities. Representations of the outsider as a social menace signal the function of racism and xenophobia in the national imaginary. As Bishop Mark Seitz has put it, the border wall merges nationalistic vanities with racial projects. Hence, fear-mongering scripts that mislead to consolidate power make people more susceptible to this predominant crisis management approach to immigration. So these diversionary tactics generally ignore structural relationships impacting migration. Reducing immigration matters to the locus of border crossers in the Sonoran Desert or the Mediterranean really eclipses transnational actors from view, much less blame. It refuses to consider those responsible for push factors like violent conflict, economic instability, and climate change. Moreover, the fear of difference is relatively easy to mass market and shape society's imaginations in powerful ways. Personal encounters with reluctant or desperate migrants can help unmask operative narratives. And whereas I'd say Christian migration ethics typically emphasizes the humanity of migrants in this vein, renewed attention to the social dimensions of Christian ethics, I think, can expand our attention beyond just the dignity of border crossers to consider global contexts that are operative, that compel migration. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to trace what I outlined in part of this chapter. I'd be happy to talk about it in the conversation, but I trace how, drawing on traditions of biblical hospitality, social doctrine, and human rights, that Christian migration ethics focuses on the plight and agency of migrants, and then relative duties of reception. It sketches how the tradition establishes a person's right to not migrate, to remain, to fulfill their human rights in their homeland, or to migrate if they cannot support themselves or their families of origin at home. Hence, in situations where individuals face pervasive gang violence or desperate poverty, the Catholic tradition supports the right to freedom of movement so that persons can live free from credible fears of violence or severe want. But what I'd like to focus my comments on this afternoon is recontextualizing migration ethics in social terms. Because the tradition's defense of these rights is rooted in a social vision that I think contests both trends that dehumanize immigrants and individualistic approaches or frameworks in migration ethics. Fratelli Tutti centers this fundamentally social vision in its moral anthropology, its understanding of social sin, its tempering of sovereignty rights alike. Persons' inherently social nature figures prominently with compelling reminders of how really recovering this reality can serve as an antidote to individualism, isolation, and indifference that harm persons on the move. So we might think of conditions that perpetuate family separation as undermining this vision of human subjectivity in ways that harms the common good. Structural analyses suggest that migration policy should consider a receiving country's economic and political complicity in generating migrant flows, rather than perpetuating convenient scapegoating. Dynamics of employer recruitment, for example, tend to be shaped by prior bonds forged by colonialism, economic ties, or military invasions. The ongoing legacy of 19th and 20th century US foreign policy and economic strategies with their attendant narratives has generated migration flows from Latin America to the United States, for example. Given such systemic culpability, some have proposed that an instability tax be levied on private and governmental entities that destabilize migrant and refugee producing regions. I think in our shared final chapter, we also draw on the migration tax or the migrant tax that Sucheta Mehta has proposed, not unlike a carbon tax on polluting industries. So for instance, hedge funds profiting from commodity trading in African minerals, or weapons manufacturers profiting from selling arms to the Middle East, multinationals more generally profiting off of degrading and destabilizing poor nations. In light of moral proximity to harm, former co-director David Hollenbach has suggested that countries that have gained economically from their former colonies or that have histories of military involvement have special obligations to people in flight from that nation. So we were talking at an event earlier this week about special, what do I want to say, duties to refugees fleeing Afghanistan in the United States after our country's withdrawal. So becoming a neighbor to the migrant through a social vision of the person and of the good means meeting basic responsibilities and justice, not just charity or hospitality alone. Again, particularly given the role often receiving nations have played in shaping conditions. So a social anthropology with its attendant rights and robust vision of global responsibilities helps recontextualize migration in the face of tendencies to locate responsibility solely with a migrant's choice to cross borders. As you can see, I've enlarged the font on some of these. What I'd like to spend time talking talking a minute about is the role that maybe the Christian conception of social sin can play, because it's a category that connects these structural relationships with their consequences, but also with their abetting ideologies. So distinct elements of social sin, whether dehumanizing trends, unjust structures, harmful attitudes, these shape complex dynamics that perpetuate inequalities. Whether in the forms of cultural superiority or profiteering, social inducements to personal sin in the immigration context abound. So this concept, as it's developed in the Protestant and Catholic traditions, draws attentions to connections between unjust structures and harmful ideologies. So for example, how powerful narratives casting immigrants as security threats or as takers influence individual roles in collective actions that impact migration, like our votes. Various levels of social sin intersect in complicated manners. Pervasive ideologies make us susceptible to myths. Operative understandings influence our actions or our inaction. So Pope Francis has long talked about, for instance, an economy of exclusion that kills. And so he's condemning there not only a reductive market ethos, but also the ways at which it desensitizes us. Fratelli Tutti repeatedly underscores other pervasive ideological threats as well. He indicates how self-absorption can fuel apathy or hardened insulation or group preservation. I think it's the first encyclical I've read about the dangers of social media. But really this sense that a consumerist culture of comfort really insulates us and can help incubate false ideologies to manipulate our conscience, right? Over the earlier part of the pandemic, I watched the docudrama, The Social Dilemma on Netflix. I don't know if folks are familiar with that, but in a similar way, I think that's like an eerie window into the manipulations of social media and surveillance capitalism. So migration discourse often focuses on political and economic considerations alone, but I think these social sins like racism or a sense of invulnerability can facilitate exclusion. So beyond identifying structural forces demanding institutional solidarity, I think a relational migration ethic entails interrogating these ideological dimensions of social sin that harden our resistance to newcomers. On the island of Lampedusa, at the beginning of his papacy, Pope Francis lamented the idolatry that facilitates migrants' depths and robs us of the ability to see clearly and even to weep over their deaths. He repeated these emphases in Manila and again in Juarez, noting that only eyes cleansed by tears can see clearly. right, I'm going to wind it up. So what I want to stress is this concept of social sin offers a framework for critiquing unequal histories of relationships between countries, such as proxy wars, as well as harmful ideologies from xenophobia to meritocracy. Portraying immigration through a lens of individual culpability alone obscures these different dynamics. And so I think a focus here can help move our analyses toward root causes of displacement and shared accountability. So finally, if that's the case, if social sin shapes or hardens our receptivity, I think formulating human rights arguments remains necessary but insufficient. So hopefully some of you got to see the Angels Unawares replica that was here on campus last November. The original is in St. Peter's Square. This is the sculptor, Timothy Schmaltz. And I think looking at that bronze and clay, where he incorporates Muslims escaping Syria alongside Jews escaping Nazi Germany, beside an Irish boy escaping the potato famine. I think in terms of Lampedusa, one could easily imagine an Eritrean on the journey. I think I was also struck taking my undergraduate students, how many of them recognized their own family histories in that sculpture, their very identities. So I think, like art, religious practices, narratives, and symbols hold potential to reshape moral imagination. So the chapter concludes by calling attention to the urgency of this formation task, which I think is distinct from humanitarian outreach or advocacy. And fostering dialogue on this is not uncomplicated. Maybe that's the blanket statement I want to say. A few years before the statue came, Ali Noorani came to campus, I think International Education Week, maybe. And in his book, he has another book since, but in this book, There Goes the Neighborhood, he captured the unexpected nature of the challenge that immigrant advocates faced, that they were mostly waging a political battle, attempting to change minds with data. And they neglected entirely to appreciate that the nation is having a debate about identity and values and culture. So this first generation Pakistani American who was raised in Santa Cruz has looked to build bridges. He traveled the country interviewing peach farmers in South Carolina, sheriffs in Utah, businessmen in Texas, seeking to kind of understand their resistance and their point of view and to forge common ground. One of his lines I like is that we need to be able to meet people where they're at, but not leave them there. So given ongoing reminders of polarization, I think this need to rebuild trust and a shared sense of community can't be underestimated. Renewing moral imagination, I don't think is unconnected to structural change, as the dynamics of social sin reveal, but that justice requires we also develop antibodies of solidarity. Fratelli Tutti does this with the Good Samaritan, but I'm going to wrap it up because I just looked at the time. I guess what I would say is all of our interdisciplinary volumes are also trying to indicate how false narratives and ideologies of security really are operative in immigration systems and in immigration thinking. And so that I hope our interdisciplinary contributions can help offer new narratives and practices to challenge the dominant power of single stories. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristen. There's so much to say about this. I hardly know where to begin. Whenever I talk about law, I feel like I need to begin with an explanation or something in the nature of an apology. It reminds me of there was a singer named John Gorka who used to begin with a song about New Jersey, and it begins, I'm from New Jersey, and then he says, I know. So I feel like with law, I want to say, I'm going to talk about a sort of capacious vision of law, which I think dovetails perfectly with the idea of moral imagination. I would start with the proposition of what human rights are. Human rights are a crystallization of political struggle that was informed by moral advocacy and moral urgency. When we settle on a conception of rights, it's because there has been a sufficient moral consensus arising out of political struggle, often led by the marginalized and the oppressed of the world and their advocates, that has settled on a formula for saying this is what we feel about that. And it's not just talk, it becomes that if it works, it becomes enforceable norms. And that's what was so interesting to me in this dialogue, and continues to be so interesting, is that I'm working on the intersection between moral discourse and legal crystallization. Now in migration law, this is really tricky because migration law is incredibly complicated. For years, courts have said things like, immigration law, there's one court that said it would cross the eyes of a Talmudic scholar. Another said it's an area where morsels of comprehension must be pried from mollusks of jargon. Somebody once said litigation before the Board of Immigration Appeals stands in the relationship to regular law that mud wrestling does to the Bolshoi Ballet. So this is the area that I have spent my life in, and I'm often asked why. Why represent migrants in legal cases? So obviously it's a good question. The work is notoriously complex, often emotionally draining, and often extraordinarily demoralizing. The enforcement bureaucracy is famously opaque everywhere in the world, and this volume illustrates a number of examples of that. It's often completely impenetrable, in fact. Enforcement is harsh, it's highly discretionary, and it's frequently arbitrary in ways that tend to evoke Franz Kafka or Captain Louis Renault from Casablanca more than any defensible conception of the rule of law. And as I have warned generations of law students, and I might as well repeat it here, there is no money in it. But I have continued to labor in these fields for my whole professional life, and I've done it with joy and with energy and with intellectual interest, emotional commitment, and yes, love. And this kind of project has reminded me about why I got into this in the first place, and has offered many new ways of framing things that had been impulses before, but now I think can be turned into particular legal ideas. And I tell my students that part of the reason that I've enjoyed this, it's kind of like, John Kennedy's whole line about we don't do these things because they're easy, we do them because they're hard. This is hard. And it's particularly hard for a very interesting reason, which is that migration law is the place where the power of the nation state and the power of a rather binary conception of law is at its absolute height. It's the maximum power of the state, sovereignty, border control. And individuals who are at the absolute minimum of their power and their status and their luck, traveling desperate migrants, confront that power. So you have this pure confrontation. In a way, it's a beautiful confrontation if you think about it that way, although it's always a tragic confrontation as well, between people at the lowest ebb of their power and the state at the highest point of its power. And so this is the place where human rights and the most basic promises of law itself are most desperately needed and most profoundly tested. And to my mind, that's what this book was about the testing and the profundity of that test. These questions are as immediate, important, and difficult as any imaginable problems of law, politics, or political philosophy. I also want to say that there's this question of praxis and accompaniment and representation that is throughout this work and throughout my discussions with Kristen. I have always been deeply moved and rejuvenated by the people that I have worked with. I never saw this work as an act of charity. I saw it as an act of together, a shared enterprise of reweaving the fabric of constitutional democracy or repairing the world, if in a different tradition is a metaphor that one might use. People need representation, but I have found that this work is a representation. It's a stylized reiteration or an interpretation of the presentation which they make with their bodies at the border. That here we are. Now you have to deal with it. And I think that having to deal with it, even though it's challenging for communities that themselves are searching for closure, legal certainty, demographic stability, even though that's incredibly challenging, I think it is inevitable. In a book that I'm working on now I make a somewhat extended argument that we are as much homo mobilis as we are homo sapiens. We are creatures of movement in every way, in the intellectual way, in the moral way, in the physical way. That is who humans are. And law has dealt with the homo sapiens part or the stability part or the community part or the sovereignty part very well, but law has been very weak for the most part, in dealing with this inevitability of human movement and the need that humans have to move, and questions of hospitality, go back to Kant, but are still very much a work in progress. All right, I've already talked more than I had wanted to, but I just want to say that my idea is that there are these moments that I would turn to Robert Cover, who was a law professor at Yale, who used the phrase juris generative. And Sheila Ben Habib in her work refers back to this idea, that there are these encounters and they are fertile moments for the creation of new legal ideas. And again, they're often poignant, tragic encounters, but they're quite interesting. So in my chapter, I focused on a couple of them, which I'll just tell you briefly about two of them now. One was the case of Cédric Héroux, who people may have heard of, who was a French olive farmer who had been helping migrants for some time cross through the Pyrenees, part of a network there, and fairly well known. The New York Times analogized his movement at one point to the Underground Railroad, but he's a very modest person actually in his own aspirations. And he just said simply, there are people dying on the side of the road. It is not right. And therefore he said, I must do something about it. And another phrase of his that I particularly like, he said, look, either you close your eyes or you don't. You know, those are your choices. And I find that very compelling myself. Anyway, he was criminally prosecuted for assisting migrants in French territory, and he was convicted. But his lawyer argued that he was not endangering the Republic. His lawyer said, remember the last words of the French Republic's motto, liberté, égalité, and fraternité, fraternity. And the prosecutors said that he was endangering the Republic, but the lawyer said, I think he's actually defending the values of the Republic. So to make a long story short, this had an incredibly successful jurisprudential career because this idea, after he was convicted, was picked up by the Conseil Constitutionnel in France and has been recognized as now as a constitutional principle in French law that actually to some degree transcends the border. This is a very big move legally, and it came out of this encounter and this willingness of this one farmer to put his body on the line and his freedom on the line to pursue that. So that's one example. Another I would give you is the case that you, again, it's referred to in a number of places throughout the book, of Scott Daniel Warren, who worked with a group that, again, many people are familiar with, No More Deaths, in the Sonoran Desert. They were leaving water for people, helping people navigate, not die, en route. He was criminally prosecuted too. What happened here was a little bit different, though. In the US legal system, he faced a jury. And his lawyer argued to the jury, essentially, and again, there's a lot more complexity here, but essentially said, do you really think this guy is a criminal? Do you really think this guy should be criminally prosecuted? Is being a good Samaritan, should it be a crime? Is it a crime? And the government said, of course it's a crime. We have borders, we have rules, people have to follow the rules. What part of, illegal immigrant do you not understand? And the jury said, well, we just don't think it's criminal. We're not going to convict him. And they refused to convict him twice. And eventually the government gave up on that. I think that's a quite interesting moment when you start thinking about how do you calibrate empathy and legal legitimacy. I think these are works in progress, but we're seeing an evolution. Of course, it's not uncomplicated. We're seeing counter evolution too. There's right-wing reactionary politics all over the world. And I personally think we need to take seriously both sides of this debate, the claims of community and the claims of humanitarian intervention. But I just want to conclude, because you mentioned Lampedusa, that another chapter that I'm working on involves the rescue captains who were bringing people into Italy, who were also criminally prosecuted for that, even though they said, look, I've got these people on this boat. I picked them out of the Mediterranean. They're going to die. What do you want me to do? And the Italians said, well, you can do what you want, but if you bring them in here, you're going to get criminally prosecuted for docking on Italian territory without permission. So one of them, named Pia Klemp, who's actually still, I think, facing prosecution and was facing up to 20 years, was given an award by the city of Paris. And she declined the award. She was given an award for her humanitarian work. And this is what she said. Madame Hidalgo, you want to award me a medal for my solidarity. She called it a crime of solidarity. She said, you want to award me a medal for my action in the Mediterranean Sea because our crews work to rescue migrants from difficult conditions on a daily basis. But at the same time, your police are stealing blankets from people who you force to live on the streets, while you raid protests and criminalize people that are standing up for rights of migrants and asylum seekers. You want to give me a medal for actions that you fight in your own ramparts. Paris, I'm not a humanitarian. I'm not there to aid. I stand with you in solidarity. We do not need medals. We do not need authorities deciding about who is a hero and who is illegal. In fact, they are in no position to make this call because we are all equal. What we need are freedom and rights. So that's where I end up in Europe. Unfortunately, I see by the old grandfather clock on the wall that our time is over. So let me, again, thank you so much for your generous presentation, and it's a work in progress, as you can see. Please join us. There's a lot of ways to engage with this work, and we're happy to be in touch with anybody who's interested. Thanks.